Hi, Misha here, and when I posted the video on the Bell AH-1Z, I mentioned that it was a backroom find that Aikens had, and that there was one other aircraft they found that really filled a niche in my collection. Also from Forces of Valor, they found a couple Martin B-26 Marauders, which was a World War II era medium bomber, and one I really needed to kind of complete my American bomber collection. Now the name is a little confusing because we don't mean this B-26, which was originally the A-26 Invader from Douglas, and we don't mean this Marauder, which is Ferengi. Just joking, but yeah, Marauder. So an interesting naming convention, but this was the original B-26. And it was actually one of two medium bombers first ordered in 1939, along with the perhaps more famous today, thanks to the Doolittle raid. Where's my hand? I brought out the B-25 Mitchell from North American. More of these were produced, nearly 10,000, compared with the Marauder, which they produced about 5,300. But the Marauder, came in to service a little earlier. In fact, it had a very quick developmental period, all things considered. And really, all of these are linked in several ways, being contemporaries of each other. So I thought to talk about it. But yeah, this model is from Forces of Valor, one they haven't done in a few years. And it's really the only quality 172 scale die-cast model of the Marauder available. This over here, the Mitchell, is a 172 scale from Corgi. And this over here, the A-26 Invader, later B-26, is a 172 scale from Hobbymaster. So yeah, with that, let's do a little history on Martin's Marauder. First off, please forgive me if I don't rotate this much. Anyone who's ever owned a Forces of Valor knows their stands are not the best. Well, before I want to get into the Martin Marauder story, let's talk about these other two. Actually, in 1938, the U.S. Army Air Corps laid out specifications for a new light bomber / attack aircraft, and North American submitted the NA-40B for this program. But it was Douglas who would win it with their, what would become the A-26 Invader. You had the gunship version, which this is what I brought out tonight. And you also had a glass nose version, which was more of a light bomber. Two-engine aircraft designed for speed. The the Douglas here was capable of over 28,000 feet altitude. It could cruise at 350 plus miles per hour. I should say its top speed is 350 miles per hour. It liked to cruise around 260, 270. Only had a crew of 3. pretty lightly armed, especially early on until they started putting the machine guns in the nose. That was more for strafing, not defense. We've got a turret in the back. We are about 50 feet long. We have a wingspan of roughly 70 feet. And it could carry a pretty respectable bomb load because of not being too heavily manned or armed, about 4,000 pounds. And that would become the Air Force's attack plane. Well, losing out on that, in March of 1939, the Air Corps, as it was still at the time, released specifications for a new light bomber. This was going to be for American allies as well as the American military. The new medium bomber needed it. Well, they were hoping for 350 miles per hour. That never materialized. It needed to have a bomb load of at least 2,000 pounds and a range of about 3,000 miles, so on and so forth. North American would rework their NA-40B into a new version, the NA-62, which you see here. And it was adopted as the B-25 Mitchell, named after famous aviation visionary. And since it was originally designed for much the same program, it's not that much bigger than the Douglas. It's about 53 feet long, wingspan of about 67.5 feet. It has a crew of 5. Had a usable bomb load of about 3,000. Quite good range, though. Little lower max altitude of about 24,000 feet. And she was the slowest of the ones we've got here, but still pretty darn respectable. It could do about 260 to 270 miles per hour max. It would definitely, of the 3 on the table, go on to be produced in the most numbers, and again would become very famous in April of 1942 during the Doolittle raid. So, if that won the medium bomber contract in 1939, what about the Martin design? Well, in July of 1939, Martin would submit its Model 179, and it too would be selected. They just decided to pick 2 medium bombers because by this point war was raging in Europe and Allies needed all the aircraft they could get, and the Roosevelt White House was not stupid. They knew that America could not stay out forever. So even before a prototype had been built, 201 were ordered. And by September of 1940, another 930 were put on the order, even before the first prototype flew. Speaking of that, there wasn't a prototype. Honestly, the first production plane was effectively the prototype. It flew on November 25th of 1940. And actually the second production plane was delivered to the U.S. Air Forces in February of 1941, and it began accelerated trials and testing at Patterson, outside of Dayton, Ohio. And within the first year, it had a pretty good reputation amongst pilots. Now, Martin really targeted the speed, so they made some sacrifices to get what they were hoping for. Again, originally the Air Force, our Air Corps originally, were very optimistic on the speed thing. So we went to a long but slender airframe. This is over 58 feet long, but it actually has the shortest wingspan of all of them. It's 65 feet. They did this to achieve a max top speed armed up of about 290 miles per hour. And it could quite comfortably cruise at about 230. It had a crew of 7. We had a tail gunner. We had a dorsal turret gunner. We had a bombardier and front gunner, pilot and co-pilot, and navigator and radio operator behind the pilot and co-pilot, who could sometimes hand off duties to each other, also working as, flight engineer or whatever might be needed. In theory, it could carry 5,800 pounds in bombs in 2 internal bomb bays with 2 cells each. But in practice, if you did this, the extra weight would just make the range about 10.5 feet. So in reality, it effectively could carry about 4,000 pounds. And typically what they would do, they would take one of the bomb bays and fill it with fuel tanks for extended range. Interestingly, they did the same thing with the A-26 Invader, and this model is a good example of it in the Pacific. And this one, they'd actually take out the ventral turret, which some had, and replace it with extended range fuel tanks. But this video is on the Marauder. It was designated the B-26 when it was selected in 1939, and then in 1941 it would acquire the name Marauder. And in the beginning, it was quite lightly armed. We had one .30 caliber machine gun in the nose. We also had one .30 caliber machine gun and a manual turret in the back. But at least we had two .50 caliber machine guns in the dorsal, the upper turret. And this was interesting in kind of ground setting, because this was the first powered turret to be featured on an American aircraft. Previous turrets had all been manually operated. So it had a very good high speed. It had a pretty good bomb capability, especially when additional fuel tanks. It could also have pretty good range. Its max altitude was actually the lowest of these, though, at just over 21,000 feet. But, early days that was good enough. Originally, these were meant to be low-altitude precision bombers. Mediums often were. By the time of Pearl Harbor, we had one bomb group equipped with these, and a couple of others already coming online. And this is when the problems began. Because of its long fuselage, high top speed, and short wingspan, it was a touchy plane to handle, especially on takeoff and doubly so on landing. It required a very high landing speed, minimum 115 miles per hour, lightly loaded, up to nearly 150 miles per hour if loaded. Trained test pilots didn't have a lot of trouble. In the first year of testing, only 2 crashes resulted in fatalities. Not bad for an aircraft that was frankly rushed, not just into production, but even design. This went from paper to production in 23 months. But once these started to be mass-produced and less experienced or even trainee pilots got their hands on it, very quickly in 1942 earned a very sinister reputation. Probably most politely, one of its nicknames was the Widowmaker, a very common name given to a challenging aircraft. Several would crash in a month during flight testing. And so many other names were given, including the Martin Murderer, the Baltimore Whore, the Flying Coffin, or my personal favorite, the Flying Prostitute. I like that one the most because it was a fast woman with no visible means of support. Also because of its very short wings at the time. Things got so bad that the owner of the Martin Company was called before the Senate to explain himself and why his airplane was not performing as expected. And under the interrogation from Truman, he basically said the problem was the wings. They were too short. When asked why, he said, we did this to get the top speed. When asked why this wasn't corrected, he said, well, we already have a contract. There's already a specification. Which is something we hear a lot even today with American military stuff. Once it gets locked into mil-spec. But Truman, kind of him being himself, but also signs at the time, said, well then, no problem, we'll just cancel the contract. So this resulted in a very early wave of changes. Martin had already been working on a new vertical stabilizer, a taller one, not much taller, but a couple of feet taller. They'd also been working on a new tail turret, one that would be powered and also have a new plexiglass canopy. And to this they added extended wings. The original wingspan of 65 feet was extended out to 71 feet. So about 6 foot. These changes, and others we'll talk about in a minute, drastically improved this aircraft. It was always a challenging plane to fly, but it at least became far less dangerous. Nevertheless, its reputation had been severely shaken right as it had entered into service, so much so that Martin and the U.S. Army Air Forces launched a propaganda campaign in 1943 and 1944, commissioning artwork, patriotic photos and drawings and paintings and articles and publications, including Popular Mechanic, basically espousing the virtues of this aircraft. And to be sure, it had some. In fact, it would go from being perceived as the most dangerous aircraft, or at least I should say bomber, to fly, to perhaps the safest. So quite a turnaround. Part was thanks to improvements, and part was thanks to perception, public perception. So, what about the service of the Marauder? Before getting that Forces of Valor 172 scale, the best I could find for a B-26 was this 1/148 scale. This one was from Altea. and isn't badly detailed for the size and money. It has spinning propellers, but landing gear fixed in the down position, and it's reasonably weighty. But I quickly discovered I'm just not a fan of 1/44 scale, at least not for planes this size. Maybe for bigger ones it's okay, but yeah. So, this came online, like I said. They started to be delivered before Pearl Harbor. First squadron was in, or I should say group, was in Virginia. And after World War II kicked off for America, they were quickly transferred to Southwest Pacific, where it saw its first combat mission bombing Japanese targets on April 5th, 1942. They would also equip some Marauders with torpedoes shackled below, and 4 equipped with torpedoes would be used in June during the Battle of Midway, but none of the torpedoes would hit their target. To be fair, American torpedoes early in the war had issues that had nothing to do with this plane, but it proved not to be a great torpedo bomber for America nonetheless. They did manage to shoot down 1-0 and kill a few people on the deck of a Japanese destroyer, but of the 4 Marauders at Midway, 2 were shot down outright, and the other 2 were badly damaged. They returned home, but they ended up just scrapping them. They would continue to fly from the summer of 1942 from Fiji and other Allied airfields, attacking Japanese-held targets in the Solomons. But they never really showed their mettle in the Pacific. They just didn't quite have it. So as the Mitchell came fully online and enough were available, these started to be used instead, and basically became the B-26's official replacement in the Japanese theater. They would continue to fly missions, both bombing and torpedo, throughout 1943. But the Marauder would fly its final campaigns in January, with the last mission being on January 9th of 1944. And then it was pulled out of theater. At this time also, the A-26, the B being the variant here with the gun nose for strafing, the C being the glass nose variant for bombing. This would soon appear in the Pacific theater as well, but it too really wasn't that well received. So it just really became clear that for that theater, the B-25 was king, at least until, of course, the B-29 came along. The Super Fortress. Really is a neat little model, but I'm sure happy to have the full size. This forces a Valor, like the higher end models. It does have crew figures inside. You can display it with gear up or down, and there's single piece plug-in gear. You can also display it with bomb bays open or closed. One thing that's kind of interesting, the bombs themselves are in the body. It's just the doors you can either open or close. You get a set for each. The turrets also move. And it's a pretty weighty model, not quite as heavy as a Corgi, maybe more on par with the Hobby Master in terms of sheer weight, but it's definitely not feeling of plastic when you pick it up. It definitely feels like die-cast. Just maybe a little bit lighter weight than Corgi is all. But these were cheaper when they were available than Corgi, so something to keep in mind as well. Well, while the Marauder was not terribly successful in the Pacific, especially as a anti-shipper, a torpedo bomber, in Europe, it had a very different reputation. Going back in time a bit, late 1942, Britain would take delivery of 52 early B-26A Marauders, and along with ones operated from American hands. These would fly along with its companion, the B-25 Mitchell, in the Mediterranean and North African regions, taking part in supporting Operation Torch in November, the reclamation of parts of North Africa. And still yet, the aircraft didn't have a stellar reputation. It had a higher loss rate, with fewer missions flown compared with the B-25. On the other hand, it was proving to be a very accurate, very pinpoint delivery system, so its attributes were starting to show. And beginning at the tail end of that year, the Free French Air Force also started to fly some B-26s, and they would continue to fly them, Britain and the Free French and America, up through the invasion of Sicily and working their way up through Italy and into South France. Now, interestingly, by this point, the B-25 was starting to fall out of favor in Europe. In fact, the U.S. Army Air Forces would not operate Mitchells from the European continent. Now, in 1942, the prototype for the Invader first flew, so it was still a ways off from being combat ready. Beginning in May of 43, Marauders began to fly from England, doing bombing raids, and it didn't go well. They were using them for daylight, low-altitude bombing, and early missions suffered high attrition from anti-aircraft fire and German interceptors. In fact, the second mission, all 11 Marauders were lost, which quickly saw the suspension of their use. Now, it's around this time, 43, that the B-26A would give way to the B-26B. Now, the B would end up having the longer wings after Block 10. They would first replace the two front 30 caliber machine guns with 50 calibers, so a total of 4 50 cals early on. Later, they would add 2 50 cals to the now powered rear turret, and even another 50 cal on the belly in kind of a tunnel position. So now we're having 6 50 cal machine guns instead of 2 50s and 2 30s. And even later on still, they would put 6 more in the front, specifically for strafing. They would also upgrade the engines. They would add additional armor. They would go to the taller vertical stabilizer, and just generally make the plane better. So by 43, better versions were coming online. The B-26B was made in Maryland, and the B-26C was made at a second plant located in Nebraska. There would be other versions, but the Ds and Es would be experimental. The Fs and Gs would see different armament changes and small upgrades. But really, the big changes happened with the Bs/Cs. When these resumed their bombing operations in late 43, they were switched from low altitude to medium altitude raids, meaning they were flying at 10 to 15,000 feet, getting them out of the range of a lot of German countermeasures. They would also improve their fighter escort, and these changes to tactics, plus the newer versions, really improved survivability. In early 1944, as these were going out of the Pacific, they were finding new roles in Europe. Their pinpoint bombing accuracy was used to great effect to attack bridges, railheads, other critical areas, and then once the V1 sites were located, they were used to attack those as well. And then after D-Day, they were used to attack strongholds and pockets of resistance in France, by this point getting those extra machine guns in the front for strafing, as well as armor columns. And then as the Allies would take the continent, they would start flying from bases in France and start really proving themselves. They became a very safe aircraft. Their speed, which had early on been a bit of a detriment because of their handling characteristics, became quite a bit their salvation. That plus the extra armor and armament. And beginning around September of 44, they were joined by their slightly littler brother, the A-26 Invader, which quickly was appreciated in Europe as well. The British and Free French would continue to fly theirs. Now, with the war obviously coming to an end in Europe, production would halt in March of 1945 with the Marauder, with just under 5,300 built. The last U.S. operation with these would take place on May 1st, attacking a German garrison, and the last Allied operation would take place on May 4th, when B-26s were used to support Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia. And this would actually be the last time a Marauder would be shot down in combat as well. So May 4 was their last combat. And remember, their first combat was on April 5th of 1942. So effectively they served for just over 3 years. And after World War II, the British would quickly retire their Marauders. They would offer them back to America, but America didn't want them, so they were just scrapped. Likewise, France would hang on to them a little bit longer until the summer of 45 and then retire theirs. And in America, they would officially be retired in early 1946. So pretty brief career, all things considered. The other aircraft, such as the Mitchell over here, would continue in various capacities, of course much diminished after the war, but they would still be flown through the 1950s. And the A-26 was really just getting started. It had quite a career in Korea and even Vietnam. It wasn't really fully retired out in one version or another until the early 70s. Now, once the U.S. Army and the U.S. Army Air Forces parted ways and the Air Force became independent in 1947, they got rid of the A for attack designation. That's when the A-26 became the B-26. In 1948. Now that was okay though, because the B-26 Marauder was declared obsolete. Officially, its name was B-26 for obsolescent aircraft, and there were only a couple left in U.S. Air Force inventory, and none left in current flying, fielded condition. So since this was no longer in service, it was okay to go ahead and name this B-26, although it's a bit of a confusing move. And the name behind this would get even more confusing as it was redesignated A-26 in the 60s. And anyway, I've done a couple of videos on the Invader, so if that interests you, you might check those out if you feel like it. So yeah, that was the Marauder. I think it's a cool aircraft. And I have a B-17, a B-24. I have B-29s, but they're not in 172 scale. They are in 144 because they're so big. But yeah, I was really wanting one to round out the collection. Plus, I do just think it's a neat design. I love how slender it is, and it was an important part of the Allied arsenal during the war. And it was just, this is the best B-26 model I know that exists in this scale. There might be others, and there are some nice mahogany models, but that's a different ball game. The Corgi 172 scales do tend to be a bit heavier. They have about the same features: gear up or down, bays open or closed, spinning propellers, crew figures. The Hobby Masters, again, have the same basic features: bay open or closed with bombs. You can open the cockpits, and you have the option with the Hobby Masters for crew in or out. And of course, with the Forces of Valor, nothing opens on these per se to let your crew in or out, so they're trapped in there. But it really is a neat model, and I'm just super glad I happened to be checking Aiken's website last week and saw these come around. They had two versions. They had this one, 1943, and they had a 1945. I just went with the 43 for no particular reason. From what my wife says, it's kind of a brown color, so yeah. But it definitely completes my American bomber group. And I've done videos on my other bombers in the past. Maybe I'll throw them all out on the table again and revisit them just for fun, because it's always fun to get them out, but it's also a bit of a pain in the neck, because especially the B-24 is huge. But I really enjoy doing these, and I was super happy to get this along with that AH-1Z Viper. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them below, unless it's about camera work, in which case, you know the deal. Blind, did the best I could, and it's getting to be a bit of a broken record thing. So, if anyone has useful advice on how I might do camera stuff better, I'm open to it. But if you're telling me I'm not the next Hollywood cameraman, I know that, so no reason to tell again. I just do these for fun, folks. And since they're free, I think that's alright. Well, this is Misha. As always, I appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I will catch you very soon next time.